President-elect Trump is likely to appoint former U.S. National Security Council official Kash Patel to a high-profile position at either the FBI or the Justice Department. That is according to a new report from Axios. Patel would be an extremely controversial selection for any leadership role, including director of the FBI. Patel served as a senior advisor to the acting director of national intelligence during Trump's first term. Since leaving the White House, he has repeatedly talked about using the Justice Department to go after Trump's political enemies and the media. The president-elect reportedly considering naming Patel deputy director or to an appointed investigative role within the DOJ to avoid a confirmation fight in the Senate. Trump is expected to fire FBI Director Christopher Wray, whom he appointed in 2017 to a 10-year term. Ken Delaney, what more can you tell us? Kash Patel has been a name that's been floating out there, that some people have been concerned about being at the important leadership position in the government, particularly if he were to lead the FBI. What else can you tell us about where he may land?
Yeah, so it seems like the Trump team has made the decision that Kash Patel is not confirmable, particularly after the Gates debacle. And that may be not so much about what he said about going after the deep state. They're all for that. It's the kind of things that are in his background that have been out there, like, for example, that he appeared to have misrepresented his role in the Benghazi case. He said at one point that he was one of the lead prosecutors, and that's just not true. And there are other things over the years that have been raised in his background. And so the plan seems to be to install him in an appointed position where he could do a lot of damage and wield a lot of power. Let's make no mistake. Deputy FBI director, for example, is essentially the chief operating officer of the department. It's a hugely responsible role. Or even if they set him loose investigating the investigators, because it's clear that that is going to happen in some form, that Jack Smith and his team will find themselves under some kind of scrutiny, he could make a lot of mischief that way. Look, Patel is sort of the personification of MAGA rage about the Justice Department and the FBI. He has been the lead in making really what are baseless charges that the FBI has been corrupted, that all these investigations were done with political interference by Democrats. I've covered these investigations for 2 years. There's not a shred of evidence that that happened. In fact, it's the opposite. Merrick Garland, as you guys were talking about before, bent over backwards to stay out of this, to appoint a special counsel, to have the political people play no role in these decisions, to a fault, some people would argue. And so, but Patel has been saying that this is the deep state corrupted the FBI to go after Trump, and he's going to mete out his revenge. And it looks like he's going to have a job where he's going to be able to do that. He could do equal damage, by the way, at the CIA, where he's also waged war on the intelligence community for many years, guys.
So, Vaughn, let's first echo what Ken said. There's no shred of evidence to any of these accusations, but let's dig in a little deeper as to who Kash Patel is and what he could do. I mean, he is sworn vengeance against those in the Department of Justice. He's also suggested that members of the media, he's by name, that he would be on his list as well. Tell us more about him, but also, like, what could this mean in terms of if he does, let's say, get a deputy job at the Department of Justice? How could he target these so-called enemies?
Right. Number one, let's be clear that Kash Patel is not a veteran of U.S. spy agencies or the intel community. He did float around during the first Trump administration, working at to essentially the right hand to the director of national intelligence, Rick Grenell, at the time. He then ended up jumping over to be the chief of staff to acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller during the events of the January 6th attack. This is somebody who is a political ally. Let's be very clear, a political ally of Donald Trump's, a loyalist who over the last 4 years has been a frequent presence, for instance, on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast. He is somebody of that ilk who has been very open about saying, whether it be criminally or civilly, that they will go after not just folks that were part of the Biden administration, but also members of the press, arguing that they have been part of the conspiracy here to undermine Donald Trump and the political efforts that they went forward. And so, to Ken's point, they could very well use the levers of the FBI or the DOJ to try to mount and convene a grand jury and try to seek an indictment over some conspiracy charge that loops in the press, loops in all the other prosecutors from the DOJ. It could be a very vast effort that they would try to put forward.
Yeah, and let me just add, I mean, this is part of a larger pattern of potential appointees who want to take their institutions and agencies and effectively weaponize them against their opponents. I was talking to Chris Murphy, the senator, last week about what he was preparing for, and he very soberly was like, I'm preparing for them to try to arrest lawmakers. And look, it may not happen. It may happen. I think the fact that they are considering the possibility certainly is frightening. In recent days, the mayor of Denver, I believe, has said, I'm not going to cooperate with mass deportation efforts. And the response from Trump officials has been, great, we'll arrest you. And I think that's really chilling, honestly, to see that people will cavalierly throw around the idea that elected officials, members of the Fourth Estate, could end up in the crosshairs and end up incarcerated simply because they disagree with the administration. But that is, Willie, essentially the through line for a lot of these picks, which is that they are there for vengeance and to carry out the political will of Donald Trump.
Yeah, we should take them at their word, and a lot of them either, as you say, want to use their position for retribution or just tear down the departments they're leading altogether. That's what they've been promising. NBC's Ken Delaney, and thanks so much for your reporting this morning. We appreciate it.